Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Apologies for the slightly croaky voice. My name is Dr. Laurie Hallett, and I'm running this session, the Day 5 session, Breaking the Sound Barrier, courtesy of UNESCO. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things about the perception of radio, about the promotion of the World Radio Day, and we're going to be looking at some of the key issues that are taking place in radio at the moment. I'd like to welcome my panelists in order that they appear on the screen. Anthony Greene from Starcom in Barbados. Hello, Anthony. Olya Booyar from the ABU. She's the head of radio in Kuala Lumpur. Edita Kudlacova at the EBU in Switzerland. And first and foremost, it should have been Mirta, but you come at the bottom of the screen, Mirta Lourenço from UNESCO. So, welcome, everyone. And before we start, I'd just like to say, for those of you watching, we'd love to hear your comments and questions at any point during this session. We're not going to run a separate Q&A at the end. So if you have thoughts and ideas, please send them through at your convenience. When you think of a good point, please make it, and we'd be delighted to consider it. Mirta, can I start with you, actually, because as this is a UNESCO session, we're talking about the role of radio in the current world. And your title is Head of Media Development and Media in Emergencies, which is where we often see UNESCO associated with the radio medium. Tell us about your job and how that's changing at the moment in this rapid technological period of advancement.
Well, my job is to develop media in the world, as ambitious as that. In particular, my angle is media pluralism and media diversity. And of course, this includes media in crisis and emergency situations. Well, it has evolved, yes, during the years. UNESCO is concerned about media pluralism in the sense that we would like each country to have a mix of types of media, radio, newspaper, online, digital media, TV, but also a mix in radio, TV, national, private, non-profit media, regional, local, national. It is this diversity of information sources that is useful for the public so that they can choose freely where to get information from. So yes, we are working for it and assisting countries, the member states of UNESCO, to have an enabling environment so that media can flourish.
Can I turn to you, Olya, in the ABU? The changing nature of radio and the changing nature of the environment that radio works in. We sometimes hear in the industry about the way that there is a perception that radio is somewhat old-fashioned and somewhat out of touch. Now, of course, I don't agree with that view, and I can think of lots of reasons. But from your perspective in the ABU, what are the challenges that face radio at the moment?
Well, I have to say that sometimes we're our own worst enemies, and we score a lot of own goals in talking about the death of radio. I mean, the medium is now 100 years old. So I think it's about time we start talking about that. But in terms of radio in the Asia Pacific, and there are two fairly distinct regions. Radio in the Pacific still is and remains, and will probably remain for a number of years and decades, one of the most sought after go-to mediums for everything, not just emergencies, but for news, for education, for everything. And in Asia, it's actually very much a thriving medium. Right across the board, from state media to public service media to commercial media. The fact is that in Asia, the commercial media is so strong and so competitive. It's actually quite vibrant. And I think the challenge is that there's so much of it that it's giving people so much choice that they actually have to look at how they listen to it. Like I know we'll talk about this later on, but we often talk about, radio and, where are we in radio as, the medium itself, and radio as if it's monolithic. But if you're looking at radio, it's everything to everybody. People in Asia listen to radio on their phones mostly. Radio is not a box. It's a medium that is kind of part of everybody's life. And I think the challenge for radio, particularly public service radio, is to be where its audience is. And in the Asia Pacific, it's increasingly on every platform. And I think we have to find our niche in that way.
Thank you very much, Olya. I appreciate that. Edita, what's the situation in the EBU region? Is it very similar? Are there particularly distinctive elements in the European region that impact on the current status and going forward the status of radio?
I very much agree to what Olya was saying. I would add one thing, and I think actually coming back to what Mirta said about the diversity, I think that we see the media mix more diverse than ever before because of the online content and all the creators. And there are a lot of people who are creating content who might not be considered as media. And I'm talking about all the independent producers and independent community type of media, online media, etc. And I think that in the past, radio had a great advantage because we started in the age when nothing else was there. Maybe books, maybe newspapers, but radio was for a very long time much more ahead than TV, the only strongest media that was everywhere. It's easy to produce, it's very flexible, you can broadcast it almost to any region, you don't need any connectivity like with Wi-Fi or internet. Whereas I think today, with Wi-Fi, especially in Europe, you have Wi-Fi almost everywhere. You have it on the train, you have it on the bus, you have it in the car. I think you have a lot more access to different types of content. You have access to visual content, to different types of audio formats. You can definitely choose what you want to listen to or watch at any single point in the day. And I think that is, and I personally don't believe that we will ever be able to create such a strong audience for any medium, for newspapers or even for radio. I think that will probably decrease to a certain point. But I think that healthy mix, that you have an audio content, including radio, you have a visual content, including television, you have a written content, including newspapers, and you have online content, is something that people want. I think we all want that. And we just need to make sure that radio adapts to this. And, like as much as we can create different varieties for different minorities, language communities, that we are really creative in coming up with exciting ideas and so that people have the reason to listen to us and come to us.
Thank you. I think that point about that radio is not a box and that radio is really about content is one that's well made and I think very well understood across the industry. I have a colleague who ran a major broadcasting network here in the UK, and he said to me recently, he said, it was so easy when you just had to get an FM license, and now you have to think about which platforms you're on and where and how do you raise awareness of those platforms. Which brings me neatly to Anthony, because over at Starcom, I wonder how you cope with the changing nature of consumption of radio.
Yeah, well, for us, what I would add is it's interesting to be able to have our internal processes kind of adapt to the changing environment. So a lot of what has said before, we're also experiencing, but we see it more of an opportunity. And we are going to be 90 years old, Starcom Network, this year, radio celebrating 100 years. And I think what we've been able to do, especially within the last 5 years, is we've been able to adapt. So once upon a time, yes, it was about, having the news at 6:30 and 7:30 and 8:30 and 12:30. That's still good. That's still relevant. But now with that information, how do we repackage it, given the changing environment that we have? But what is important is that we continue to focus on the values that make us strong: impartiality, inclusiveness, and I think that part about being inclusive is really critical, because one thing about radio that keeps it going strong, especially in the Caribbean, is that we allow all voices to participate, and people therefore see it as relevant, even with the changing environment. If anything, I think they're working hand in hand fairly well.
I'm just wondering, in terms of that, the delivery of radio. I mean, we have a variety of different systems. We have established long-term analog broadcasting systems, AM and FM. We have DAB, and we have other digital platforms. But we also, of course, now have a wide range of distribution via apps, which are either station or group specific or are more generic in terms of what they offer to the listener. And the point about how you might repackage content and how you might deliver that content in ways that make it more accessible. What do you do, Anthony, just to continue with your point there, what do you do in terms of using the, if you like, the traditional linear analog platforms to promote the content that you're taking and delivering elsewhere on other platforms?
Yeah, I think it's really important. This is where allocating resources become important. Defining, first of all, the needs of the audiences. I think the point was well made that one of our challenges will be we need to remain where audiences, we need to be where audiences are. But what it requires is that internally, you have to be able now to allocate your resources, have the right skills, and basically train upward. That's going to remain a conversation. We have to keep up with the changing environment. And so what we've realized, look, we can't only focus on going before the microphone and delivering a prepared bulletin at a specific time. So let's look at our resources and how do we allocate, for example, a resource to focus on digital for the day, and what is the role of that individual. So the roles have clearly changed and continue to change as well. And so, it's about short format writing, long format writing. Before that was a separate thing. We left long format writing for newspapers, right? But now you have to be able to blog on an event when it's happening. At the same time, how do you bring in your subject matter experts, your sources, etc., and be able, in terms of your technical capacity now, to have that information delivered in the right way. So not everything will be a 30-second clip anymore. So it comes down to how we as managers, and that's key, that we who are leading have to be very discerning now that it's a change environment, and how we train is going to be key, and how we allocate resources is critical.
Thank you, Anthony. There's a comment just come in from Mano Ritola, and making the comment, as said, radio should adapt to current needs and should also be promoted actively, especially amongst young people. Several hours ago, I saw a comment from a Japanese radio person visiting Laos. In this country, he or she said, radio and television are not the majority medium. Even the kid Buddhist priests are using smartphones for information and entertainment. I'm sure that's absolutely true, and thank you very much for that comment, Manu. But of course, it comes back to the point that Olya made earlier on, that radio is not the box, it's the content. And I wonder whether we're at the point now where we're actually primarily designing the content in some cases for that online consumption rather than for the traditional linear platforms. Anyone perhaps might like to take that.
Yes, I would like to add to the challenges that that radio is suffering. Two. One is financial, the other one is editorial, but they are linked, and they are linked to what my friends were saying before. We have to remember that radio stations are usually small and medium enterprises, and they have suffered during these last years of advertising revenue decline, because most advertising went to internet platforms. And actually, even public service broadcasters have been suffering of this, and in some cases, even the loss of public funding. So in this context, what comes out first? It's staff. And in particular, which staff? The staff that you think you can do without. For example, those that are in charge of fact-checking. And this builds on the other challenge for radio stations, which is the danger always of losing the precious trust that, as of today, listeners still have on radio as a medium. Once radio, in terms of content, loses the capacity, the ability, or the interest of checking the sources, and only tell the news as verified, then we would have a negative impact on radio. Radio still, in terms of content, it's not just to adapt and go where the audience goes. It's also to remember to be a vigilant of human rights violations, to hold the powerful to account, and to be editorially independent. That is not fall into the temptation of political, ideological, business pressures, and the like.
Can I ask a question to probably Edita and Olya in particular, which is in that challenging environment that's financially challenging and the challenges around editorial content, what does the role of regulation play? Because if you look, for example, at American radio and TV, and you compare that with European TV, and I suspect much of the TV and radio in the Asia Pacific region, it's a very light touch regulation in the US, and then you lose perhaps that editorial impartiality and balance. So is it a fact that radio regulation is key to ensuring that editorial independence, or can it be achieved without it?
No.
So I think in Europe we have, because we have the European Union, and a lot of the regulation is also regulated, above the state. So it's not all national; it's also European. I think the national regulation is absolutely key, especially for public service radio. Probably not so much in terms of the editorial independence with the commercial radio, but definitely in the public sector. Our members, the European Broadcasting Union members, are all regulated nationally. And that means they should be, and they are independent from the political power and from the political influence. And I think that's absolutely crucial if you want to keep the high index of trust in radio content, because radio has always been the most trusted medium. We have our own research at the EBU, and I think over the last 12 years since we were running the research, radio is always number one. And that goes much further beyond. It's much stronger than for not only traditional formats like television or newspapers, but even certain national institutions like even law or legal institutions. And I think that's just because of the editorial independence, and people simply trust the content, they trust the human voice, they trust what people are saying on radio. And I think then there is the next layer, and that's the EU regulation. I think that's especially important in distribution, and especially for connected screens and connected devices. Because I think if you don't have that secured, if you don't have regulation for platforms and for screens, it can easily happen so that radio turns into one of the sources of some kind of a content, but it loses its position where it should be free for everyone, and it should be reachable, or you should be able to reach that signal everywhere. Because once you are dependent on the Wi-Fi and on connectivity, I can imagine even countries like Norway or some other countries where the regions are quite wide, you have a lot of mountains, it doesn't have to be that stable, and it doesn't have to be that easy that you always have radio signal. So I think that in our case in Europe, it might be different in Asia. I think the national legislation is very important. We see it in every single state here. And then you have EU regulation, and I think it's becoming equally important. Right.
Thank you. Would you like to add to that, Olya?
Yes, it's a lot different in the Asia Pacific. I mean, for one, the Asia Pacific has 2/3 almost of the world's population. Many more countries, many more huge countries, small countries, very well-resourced countries, very badly resourced countries that are disappearing because of climate change, countries that have lots of wars and destruction happening year in and year out. So when we look at something like radio trust and trust in the media, I have to say people don't make so much distinction between what is, public radio, public service radio, what is radio that's commercial, because a lot of it again, caveat, it depends on the country. So if, let's say, if I go through the region, if you go to Australia, it's very distinctive. You have a market that is there's the ABC, SBS, and then there are the commercial radio players. Now, all of them are also starting to cooperate with each other, because it's all about content. It's no longer, you have to come to my station, you have to listen to my radio. People are trying to get content out to their audiences. Okay, DAB in Australia is great. There's even in the commercial stations, the revenue is rising. Which is quite unbelievable in some cases, but it's happening sort of quarter on quarter. It's getting better. And with the ABC and SBS, the times when their listenership goes through the roof is at times of crisis. On the one hand, when there's national emergencies because of that trust, and for example, at the end of the year, when there are things like, the cricket test and everybody's listening to it, so it's an interesting conundrum in that respect. So when you move to the Pacific, in some countries of the Pacific, there are no TV stations, so radio is it. So, and these countries are very small, islands, states are small, they're not hugely resourced, and everything depends on the person who's on air. And most people don't listen on a physical radio, they listen on their phones, and we have to kind of get past that whole thing about who's regulating what. And then when you get into Asia, when you're talking about regulation, the airspace is incredibly full. You've got everybody there. You can't just say, okay, I'm only going to listen to this one or that one. Everything comes in, and a lot of the languages are being heard everywhere. Like, for example, we are in Malaysia, so you have Malay, you have Bahasa, but Indonesia is also Bahasa, slightly different, but it's one major language group. Then you have China and Chinese. Malaysia also speaks Chinese. A lot of other people speak Chinese. So that whole complexity of who listens to what and what voices there are becomes really difficult, and regulation kind of takes a back step because people want to listen to content, and they increasingly listen to content with people that they trust. And how do they trust them? Is because they can identify with them, and they identify with them through content, not through stations. So it's a much more a person-to-person thing. And I think it's one of those things that we have to rethink in how we look at radio and stations and brands, and how we actually measure the listenership. That it's not just tied to a radio station or somebody turning the dial, which, even now, like when I laugh when I talk about that, because nobody turns the dial anymore, So we really, I think a lot of that has to be rethought and reprogrammed. And, I can go on for hours, but I think that whole, regulation in a sense, regulation's everywhere, and it has an effect on how and when we broadcast. But I think radio's beauty is that it kind of, in a lot of ways, it slides under the surface of a lot of stuff, because to this day, media regulation is focused so much on television and on visual stuff that radio tends to work through and within the margins really well to be able to broadcast when it needs to and to connect when it needs to. So I think the more problem that we have is actually trying to find how we measure this new world, so we can say to the people who give us money, whether they're governments or whether they're advertisers, no, we actually have these followers, listeners, whatever we want to call them, and they're here because they want to listen to us, because they trust us and they want us in their lives.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'd like to say hello to Boyd Leader in Canada. Boyd, good. Where are we going to be? We're going to be good morning over there, I think. You mentioned, he says, the light touch of regulation in the US, and he's checking in from Canada, where there's much more regulation. The challenge there is that the Canadian audience is inundated with American media. So the question that he raises is, how can we maintain the regional uniqueness in a shrinking world when consumers have the option of a less regulated source? Anthony, could I put that one to you? I wondered, do you find an impact of international media, or are you, as an island state, somewhat insulated from that?
Well, I think we have significant regulation. There's a broadcast authority in Barbados. It's elected by the government, yes, and they do have a presence. But one of the things that radio has carried with it over many years here in Barbados is standards. It's expected, really, in broadcasting, set by those who pioneered radio in the early days. And so even though there is, yes, something in place by for regulation, there are laws that we operate by, there's a strong sense of self-regulation, if you can call it that. It's very key. And then it even goes beyond that. In Barbados at Starcom Network, we have 4 radio stations, 60% of the market share. And the other significant player is actually the public broadcaster. And I did mention values earlier. What we've recognized here in Barbados at Starcom Network is being a preferred broadcaster has a lot to do with the values that we stay true to. So impartiality, independence, fairness, public debate. And those are things that our listeners over the years continue to hold us to. They expect that of us. So there is a strong sense of self-regulation there, and it creates a unique proposition for us. So we are loved because people feel like, okay, when I'm heard on the stations of Starcom Network, it's going to make a difference. We are going to be open enough to tell the other side of the story. So I want to hear what they're saying about this particular issue. Let me just give you a quick example. Let's talk about the roads in Barbados. So yes, we have a beautiful island here, full of sunshine, small island, but we do have problems with roads, the quality of our roads from time to time. And on one of our stations, VOB 92.9 FM, we have a call-in program Monday to Friday, and even Sundays as well, when we focus on a panel. But Monday to Friday, the listeners set the agenda. What do? They call and they talk about everything. They talk about things that are going well. They talk about things that are not going well. And in recent times, the roads have not been going well because there in some instances where the roads, there are many roads that need repair. And they call, they say, where the roads need repair. My car is suffering. It's dropping into the potholes. I'm changing my tires. I'm getting lost because the whole car can fit into the pothole, and so you have a situation where people pay attention, and all of a sudden we have the roads being fixed. So you see where that participation of the audience and the expectation that if I mention these things on VOB 92.9 FM during the calling program down to brass tacks, I'm going to get heard, and there's something is going to be done. And so there's a standard that is created. And that particular program, down to brass tacks, we did a survey in 2022, and 6 out of every 10 persons surveyed listed Down to Brass Tacks as their favorite radio program. So that's just to show an example of how then we are under pressure to make sure that we stay true to the standards that we've set, and those gone before really, who've created that opportunity for the people of Barbados. They've done that, and we have to maintain it.
So know your audience, understand your audience, and understand its needs and interests is the way to hold on to them, perhaps. I'd like to go back, if I may. Actually, before I go back, could I just say thank you very much, Boyd, for that observation about regulation in the Americas. And if anyone else has any other comments they'd like to make or questions they'd like to pose, please feel free to do so in the comments section of this presentation. Olya, you mentioned about the importance of radio in emergency situations. And I know, for example, that here in the UK, that local radio for the BBC as the public service broadcaster is a minority sport most of the time. But when things go wrong, boy, do their audience shoot up. I'm also very much well aware of the situation that happened, sadly, in Africa some years back, where one of my students was looking at the impact of radio during the Ebola epidemic, and the impacts that had in helping inform people's behaviours to reduce the impact of that terrible disease. And then going back to a friend of mine who set up a radio station without a license in America during the floods in St. Louis some years back, because people needed radio in order to know what was going on. Have any of you got examples of particular situations where radio has really been able to make an impact when things go wrong?
It's hard, it's hard to pick one because I work in a Asia Pacific. If you want to talk about disasters, you just look every week. There's something going on, and I have to say, we kind of joke about it, but it's in a very serious way. Radio is the medium that survives. It's the only medium that survives during disasters. The ABU does a lot of work on disaster risk reduction, on preparedness. We do a lot of that through TV, but we also do a lot of it through radio. One of our very large members, NHK, in Japan, they have a massive program that they do on radio and television online in terms of preparedness and in terms of educating people what to do when anything strikes. And they're actually, one great thing about, the ABU and its members, they share between each other. Those programs, there was a program years ago called Bosai, and it's basically how you act during emergencies. And that program is now in so many different countries of our members, because it's a format that works so well that it's just got replicated, and it's named after something very big, like in Indonesia, it's named after a big sort of gong that they use for ceremonial practice, and that the sound of that means that you know that something's coming, something important is coming, and it's there to warn you and to prepare you and to remind you that you know all of this stuff. So, it's getting away from Australia, and a couple of years ago with the fires and everything else that happened. The ABC did a wonderful work, and not just informing, but also entertaining, because we tend to forget that during emergencies and when people are really suffering and they really want to know what's going on, in their area and their neighbors and with their families elsewhere, they also need some light and shade, because you can't keep at that heightened level of anxiety for such a long period of time. Our members in Tonga, when everything went out, they had radio in a box, and that worked. In Australia, they still talk about wind-up radios during emergencies. In Indonesia, radio is the medium that people go to because nothing else is working. Bangladesh, same thing. So there's just so many different examples of what happens. But I think our challenge actually is to sustain that, not just do it through the disasters, but to somehow weave that in. So people go to us in all the times, not just during the disasters, I've got to turn that on because I trust it, but to be able to weave that into the rest of the year and everything else that we're doing.
Thank you very much. Edita, can I turn to you? One of the things that's happening in the European region is that a lot of the if you like, the legacy technologies are disappearing. So long wave transmitters being turned off, AM being gradually reduced. And then we see the Ukraine war and the Polish government turning back on its long wave transmitters because they do something that other things can't do. Back in the 70s and 80s, the emergency platform in the UK was the long wave radio system. So if there was a national emergency, that's what they would use. Quite frankly, I should know better, but I actually don't know what the system is now. When you're bringing in digital platforms and you're removing the legacy transmissions, isn't the challenge of how do people actually rely on those systems, that the ruggedness, the robustness of, for example, DAB, is it as good as old-fashioned AM? I pose the question.
It's a great point, Laurie, and thank you for bringing that up. I think that it's also connected very closely to the topic of regulation that we were talking just a couple of minutes ago about. I think we saw it, unfortunately, with Ukraine in real life, that the digital platforms, Wi-Fi connection and online content is not stable enough and it's not trusted enough. And I don't think it will be, because if we see also the danger of cyber attacks and hacking and disinformation, fake news, etc., I think that everybody sees we need, and we will urgently need, I think more and more, the need will be increasing, a stable broadcasting system. And what we might see today as legacy, and I agree with you that, we are talking about AM or we are talking about FM, those are networks that have been built years ago, but they're still functioning. And when we were helping our member Ukrainian Radio Suspilne during the start of the war, we were literally looking around the world for the AM transmitters, and we were trying to get them to the territory of Ukraine, or at least broadcast around the region. So we had our Romanian radio who helped us transmitting that distribution. We were working with Radio Free Europe, and I could name a bunch of others. It's not just, like during this war or this political conflict, but there are many more cases when I think this will be more needed. And then if you look at regulation, I know that we are looking, and it's important to look a lot on online content, on the platforms, on the competition on the market, on the digital market, etc. But I think that we need to make sure that we have something that's stable, that's reliable, and that's not in the hands of commercial companies. I have nothing against commercial market or, the fair competition on the market. But I think especially for the need of normal citizens and inhabitants of every single state in the world, I think we need something where they can trust it's not in the hand of somebody who's making profit on it, or that it can be easily hacked, or you can spread whatever disinformation through that chain. And I think we saw it with online content, that it's just very easy to do that. And we need to make sure that we limit that kind of visibility of disinformation. And I think this is why the regulation is also important to be put in place. And just like Anthony was saying a couple of minutes ago, I think it's a lot about the conversation with the actual listener, with the user of your content, and to be in touch with them. So you have their direct response, you know who that person is, where they are calling from. You can get so much interaction with people who are in need during the emergency situations. Olya was talking now about the situation in Asia, where I can imagine that during the climate and all the weather changes, etc., you have extreme weather forecasts and extreme changes of different conditions. But also in Europe, that has been for a very long time a stable continent in terms of climate. We have seen floods, I think, almost every summer for the past couple of years. We have seen earthquakes, we have seen hurricanes, and a number of other disasters that were going through the European continent. And when we were looking at the figures from the United Nations, I think they were released last year or the year before, they said that the likelihood of these disasters to take place increases every year. And I think by 2030, it should be 560 disasters per year, whereas today we have 350 to, I think, 450 or 500. So it is increasing, and it is important that we have a stable network and a stable broadcasting system and a stable transmission. And if we have something that has been proved by time, it has been proved by different conflicts and wars, and it can be FM, it can be DAB, maybe in Norway, it can be other systems in other countries. I think that's what we need to preserve. That's my point of view, but I think it is really related to regulation.
Can I ask a supplementary question to that, Edita, which is, in the European Union has regulated for the inclusion of DAB radios in across the market, and that has impacts because of the way car manufacturers work. That means that DAB becomes available in models in other countries as well. But at the same time, we've got the industry in America trying to defend itself against the car manufacturers who want to remove AM. And I wonder whether there is a place for the wider regulation of ensuring that AM remains in vehicles.
I think the question of AM is actually dependent on what type of car you have. I'm not a technical person, Laurie, so if I say something technically wrong, don't but I'm sorry about that. But from as far as I can understand, the hybrid cars or the electric cars, they might have an interference with AM. And I think that that's something that in the US they have seen with certain types of cars. I'm not saying that it's with every single company or every single type of car, but it can happen. But I think it's also in the US, the AM network is more, even today, because you have long regions, you have, like long highways where you don't have houses or you don't have dense population. I think for them, it's even more important to keep AM. And what we are basically saying and if I speak from my job from the EBU, we say that people should have access to radio, and it's almost regardless of the platform. Yes, it is online and it will be online, and we want it online as well, but you also want a stable platform. And in some countries it is DAB, in some countries it is AM, and in some countries it is FM. And we need to make sure that that remains. And car, that has been traditionally one of the probably most favorite location to listen to the radio, because while you're driving or while you're with your family or with your friends in the car, usually you only listen to audio and you don't have the time to watch a movie or to read newspapers or whatever. So I think the car is very important for us. And let's be honest, I think during the war, during emergency, it is quite a safe battery on wheels, nothing else than that. It just moves you from point A to point B, but you are still able to receive information. And that is important, I think, to preserve radio in the car.
Thank you. Mirta, can I come to you and just ask, in terms of your role in UNESCO, do you worry about the gatekeeper effect of some of the platforms that are not directly traditional radio? In other words, the fact that if you are running platforms which go through commercial operators, there may be economic reasons why they don't deliver. There may be technical reasons that they don't deliver because of a lack of regulation, and then the material doesn't get to the communities which you're trying to reach. Is that a concern, or do you feel that in practice actually people do get the information regardless of platform?
I don't know what you mean with regulation. If you mean regulation of content, it's a difficult concept.
I beg your pardon. No, I don't mean the regulation of content. Okay. I mean the requirement that people have access to content from a multiplicity of services. So I'm not talking, in America, they sometimes talk about the must carry rule. You must carry this service, but more about ensuring that in times of crisis and on a day-to-day basis, that there is an openness of the platforms to the multitude of voices that you're trying to reach and trying to receive.
The ideal situation is that everything will exist. It's not one or the other. That is, it's broadcast networks, satellite networks, broadband, and cable. The thing is, in emergency or crisis situations, many times there is no electricity, there's no connectivity, and the ones that do have the robust infrastructure are the satellite and broadcast networks. That's why in every single emergency kit, your private emergency kit, they tell you keep the torch, keep the whistle, have a bottle of water and a transistor, because that one, the infrastructure is powerful enough. Second, they usually have supplementary power mechanisms in place. And third, broadcasters usually have an emergency plan with the teams also trained on how to continue covering the news during emergency situations. So it's not one of the other, it's the diversity, it's the multitude. And matching what Edita was explaining, it's not that we don't want cars to have internet or access to streaming platforms or other audio services that are not broadcast. They are welcome. It's just that the consumer or the person, the citizen, has to be able to make a choice, has to be able to choose and not to be imposed only one source of information. The robots, I can exemplify you with one example in a developed country and one in a developing one. Edita knows that in Germany in 2021 there was a big flood in a valley, the Achre Valley, I think it's called. And no, it's a developed country. It's here around the corner from France. There was no electricity. The only ones who were able to give life-saving information were FM radio and I think it was terrestrial TV as well. In Suriname, many years ago, like 20 years ago, UNESCO funded a project or supported a project in a remote indigenous area. There were descendants of slaves who lived there, and the area was called Gansi. To arrive to this area, you had to make, I think it was 5 hours in a bumpy and dusty road. Then you had 2 hours on a canoe on the river, and then you got to that area. There, a group of indigenous people set up a radio station, an FM radio station with the help of UNESCO. They were actually women, the managers of the radio station. That radio station still broadcasts today, because when there are floodings, because the area is so ruthless, with strong winds, with the river and blah, blah, blah. So they put the radio station, the premises, up on a hill. They are the only ones who keep broadcasting whenever there's a flooding, because they are safe from this natural hazard. So I could tell you about many other examples. UNESCO also supported radio stations in the prison in Jamaica, by the way, also with a place where there is always sunshine and colorful music and spicy food, and known for reggae and sports people. And this radio station that UNESCO supported was run by the prisoners, and it ended up, because they were broadcasting on FM, they ended up being very popular also with the officers and personnel in the prison and the community around, and it created a sort of resilience, let's say, mood in the community, and it helped everybody understand each other, their points of view and what was important for that community. Also in where was this, in Jamaica as well, we had a radio station set up in the garbage van, the plastic one, the big plastic one that are very common in developing countries. That helped through a crisis situation, because it helped reach populations that were hard to reach, populations that might have felt intimidated by going to a radio station. They're in the street with a radio station that broadcast from a container. They felt they could talk more easily. And this, which Anthony was also highlighting before, this that radio gives the voice to the street, to what's happening around, to the local communities, the ones that do not get into the mainstream media. This is also what is taking radio to the next century, let's say.
Thank you. And I wonder, on that basis, Mirta, the changing nature of radio. And when radio started, of course, it tended to be quite monolithic and serving quite large areas. But we've seen across many parts of the world the rollout of not-for-profit community services, if you like, as an adjunct to public service. They're not commercial, but they have a very specific focus on a target community. That may be a geographical community, it may be a community of interest, a language group. How important is that going forward in terms of the diversity and development of radio in all its various forms that we've been discussing over the past 50 minutes or so?
Yes, it is to be preserved because it is also important for local languages and for access to information in local languages. I mean, many radio stations around the world, I mean, I visited many in many regions of the world. Some do not have a roof. They are very humble, 1-2 persons who do everything. They do the reporting, they do the interviews, they do the accountancy, and they work in the farm, you know, or they work in the plantation, you know, they do everything. And it's community-based. So it's more or less like public service in a mini scale, you know. It's owned by the community, run by the community, and speaking about things that matter to them. For example, there's no cotton in the hospital. The flooding took the bridge away. The children cannot go to school. There's no bridge to cross the river. You know, these things don't get to the main media. Otherwise, when they broadcast, they would broadcast either music or they would broadcast news that come from the national level or the news agency or even the international one, which is maybe not relevant, not so relevant to the community. You know, it is relevant in one sense, but in the other one, it's not. So, look, the death of radio has been proclaimed so many times. You know, remember when television burst into space? The people thought nobody's going to listen to radio anymore. It didn't happen. Also, by the way, when the little filming cameras came out, these 8 millimeters, people thought that's the end of cinema. It was not, you know. It's never the end, you know. Radio just takes the new advancement in technology and, you know, multiplies its audience. I wanted to tell you something that a bit the problem of radio is this, that it's perceived as obsolete, but it's not obsolete. And it's perceived as obsolete because many think only of the transistor, you know, but radio is all this that we have been mentioning today, DAB, it's the satellite, it's the streaming radio, it's everything at the same time. And I had been checking the global market, and if you only take terrestrial radio, the global market as estimated for 2024 is $35 billion. And it has been steady with no decline, at least since 2000, which is what I was checking, you know. So it's not dead at all. And there is these challenges that we have mentioned. And I would add to what you said like 10 minutes ago, it's not just content and the audience, you know, it's also professional standards, journalistic standards that radio will try, even if it's costly, it costs money, as I mentioned before, but to keep the journalism ethical standards of impartiality, of fact-checking, you know, and accountability to the general public, to the listeners.
Thank you. I wonder, this is probably mainly for Edita and Olya, but Anthony, you may have a comment about this as well. I wonder what that relationship is like between the established public service broadcasters and these newer community stations that do contribute a public voice, but outside those traditional structures. How does that work, for example, in Europe or in parts of the ABU region? Do you want to go first?
I think it's clear that where we all agree and or is synchronized in is the distribution. I think that discussion goes between distribution and content, where I think on the distribution we are clear, and I would repeat myself in saying that you need a robust, technically stable distribution network. And then in the online field, as Mirta was saying, we have to develop and we have to progress and we have to be attractive, etc., etc. And obviously also with the increase of podcasting, and especially with young people who like to listen, it's not about that they wouldn't want to listen, they like to listen, the competition changes, and there are many more players in that competition. And I think that is also bringing us to the other side, and that's the content. And I think on the content side, you can compete, you can be creative, and that's what you need to preserve is your talent, and you really need to invest a lot in people who have ideas, who are great voices, who are great hosts, and nourish that. But I think on like the practical side of the distribution, I think it's all one part, it's all one discussion. Not sure if I'm answering your question, Laurie, but
No, I think what I'm getting at is that very often you can find that community stations with people who have a passion for finding out about their communities, they end up on public service anyway, because the public service broadcasters are good at recognizing talent. We're coming towards the end of this session, but another question has just come up, so I'd just like to run past that because I mustn't forget this, Mirta, before we talk about International World Radio Day. So we must talk about that just before the end. But I beg your pardon, Bala Morale from, I'm not quite sure where you're from, Bala, but you ask, in light of the current economic climate, what innovative strategies can radio networks employ to not only connect to communities, but also address and navigate the economic challenges, ensuring sustained relevance and impact? That question is perhaps a little bit longer than we've got time for, but I'd welcome any thoughts that anyone has. Perhaps, Anthony, you've really kind of addressed this, but is there anything you'd like to add to what we've said already?
Sure, very, very briefly. I'll put it like this. Very often, we're known for things like reporting the news, all right, analyzing the issues, okay? So we know what the issues are. We know how to involve other people to find solutions, but we ourselves must be involved in transformation, okay? And just to put a cap on that, I mean, our Prime Minister here, Mia Motley, has been on the international scene talking about things like climate change, food security. In terms of media, breaking those things down and helping people to understand what they mean, and then also facilitating participation. So how do we participate as a country, with media involved, in helping people to grow their own food, for example, share their experiences while doing that, okay? And I'll give you an example that happened just the last couple of weeks. There was a man, there were two men who were shot dead by a farmer. We carried that news story, okay? But that news story quickly developed into a conversation about predial larceny and food security as well. And I think as media practitioners, brought the power of voice, because that's what radio is, the power of voice in motivating people in really understanding these issues and how we can participate in solutions is a very strong proposition. Do not let us stop at the fact that two men were shot dead. That's important, that's key. Yes, we need to know that, but there are all kinds of criticisms and we can just stop at that. But there's a broader conversation and solution that the country, the nations need to be involved in, and radio can help drive that transformation. That's where the relevance is, because that involves the business side of it as well, the policy side of it. It's very wide, and I feel proud that radio helps to drive that kind of transformation, and we have many examples.
Thank you, Anthony. That sounds to me like a very good way to summarize a lot of what we've been talking about. But Mirta, before we finish, I'm backing up Boyd here, who's said that Walkman was going to kill radio. Well, how wrong they could be, and I completely agree with that comment. But World Radio Day is coming up.
Yes.
I'm interested in the importance of partnerships in that, and also how stations and others can get involved.
Yes, I'm going to that in 1 minute, but if you
Thank
allow
you.
me to add to what Anthony was saying, which is very important, is that I understood the question as to funding models, or what do they do with this big viability challenge that radio stations have. And I would say that new funding models have to be researched, discussed, investigated. Could be subscriptions, could be paper listened audio, could be membership models, could be many other very local advertisement. Look, we were supporting some radio stations in Africa, in 10 countries, 59 radio stations some years ago, and one radio station came to a community radio station, a farm radio station, and they came up with the idea of broadcasting. They broadcast your wedding, for the community people. They go with the microphone and they interview the guests, the bride, the mother of the bride. It's a simple thing, but you cannot believe how popular it became, and for the radio station, it was an income source. However humble it may seem from a big city, a big international city, but for them it was important. There was another one that came to, they advertised the mass, the religious service, at what time, which day, and the obituaries, but people, they cannot maybe afford the obituary or something in the newspaper, but they can afford the $1 in the local radio station. For them, it was nice. For the radio station, it was a source of income. So new funding models have to be discussed and be creative about what your community of listeners need. Now, going to World Radio Day, this is very important. This is the day the radios celebrate themselves, radio, and they say we are here, we are still existing. This World Radio Day is also honoring more than 100 years of service to humanity, and I would encourage all radio stations and radio fans to visit www.worldradioday.org. There we have placed a number of ideas, actually 13 ideas of how to celebrate radio on 13th of February. And we also are giving copyright-free and free of charge audios of 1 minute that radio stations can broadcast or people can share in their social networks regarding radio. And most importantly, this year, together with Olya and Edita and other broadcasting organizations, we have created partnership opportunities. So you can go to the part called Partnerships Opportunities, and there you register if you wish to partner with another radio station in the world. Because, radio hosts and radio teams are usually looking for people to interview, people to have co-productions with, people to have joint guests or be the guest one of another. And what would be more beautiful than a radio station in Africa partnering with a radio station in, in Asia, for example, or Europe. So it's very simple. There is a map with a lot of the radio stations that already have registered. You see there on the screen, all those who are in green, they would like to be contacted to do something together with another radio station. So go ahead and take this opportunity. Do something together to celebrate what is your own day. Hashtag World Radio Day.
Thank you, Mirta. Thank you very much indeed. I shall be chasing my colleagues at our university radio station to make sure they're involved again this year. They have been for a number of years, and the students always find it very engaging. And it's linked the community, this UK community, with communities in various other parts of the world over a number of years. So that web address again, www.worldradioday.org. Thank you very much to Anthony Greene, to Edita, Kudlacova, to Olya Booyar, and Mirta Lourenço. Thank you very much for that session, which I think, if I was to wrap it up in one sentence, I would say that the diversity of voice that radio has always celebrated is now also a diversity of platform and a plurality of access. That $35 billion turnover is pretty impressive, but it's all down to what do you do in terms of funding at the local level. I'm Dr. Laurie Hallett. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of World Radio Week as it draws to a close. Thank you.